Hi everyone. Today we are going to talk about lecture 14. Lecture 14 basically talks about factor market. So before we start talking about the factor market, let's first review the circular flow model or circular flow diagram that we discussed in the very first chapter. If you remember, we had two markets and two entities, households and then businesses, right? Households provide factors of production or the resources to businesses so they can produce so that they can process those resources and make goods and services, and in return the businesses pay the households the factor payments because of the resources. And if you remember, the factor payments are for land, it's rent; for labor it's salary; for capital it is interest; and for entrepreneurs it is profit. So that's what's happening. Basically, they provide the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. In return, they pay rent, salary, interest, and profit. And then this market where this exchange takes place is called the factor market. And then businesses use these resources and produce final goods and services or finished goods and services which are bought by the households, and in return household pays a price for these goods which go as revenue to the businesses. Now this was covered in the very first class, right? We did this diagram in class and understood how it worked. So that's how that's how the circle is created, right? Basically, with the income they are receiving, from the businesses, this they are basically using that income to buy the final goods and services, and that income again goes back to the business as revenue, which they then again use to pay the household. So it's a circle, right? So the income is flowing in a circle. Now so far whatever we have talked all related to the product market, but today in this chapter we are going to focus on the factor market, the market in which households sells land, labor, capital, an entrepreneur, and businesses pay these factor payments. So we are going to focus on the factor market today or in this lecture. So basically, again, the circular flow of diagram illustrates the flow of resources from households to businesses. In order to, basically businesses are acquiring the resources from the household and paying the factor payments. And on the other hand, businesses process these resources and make goods and services which are then acquired by the households. And we have two types of markets here, the factor market and the product market. Product market basically exchanges finished goods and services, and the factor market exchanges land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur for rent, wage, interest, and profit respectively. Again, what I just said is just a summary of what I'm saying. Now, factor market allocation for land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur is based on the cost of that resource relative to their contribution of the output. So basically, what this line is saying is how much quantity of labor I will use for the production will depend on the cost of the output, or cost of the input, or cost of that labor, and how much this labor is contributing to the final goods and services. So again, what I'm trying to say is, let's say in order to make a water bottle, I need one labor, and what is the cost of that labor, and how much that labor is contributing towards making that water bottle. Let's say 40% of the contribution is from the labor in order to make a water bottle. So that means the allocation of the labor will be based on that cost of that input, as well as how much contribution it is making to the output. The allocation process establishes what resources are used, and this interplay among resources ultimately determine the cost and the income to the factors. So basically what it's trying to say is this allocation process ultimately determines your income. If labor is contributing more, then labor will towards a product, then labor will receive more income than capital. Let's again say, in order to make a water bottle, let's say 60% of the contribution is by labor and 20% is by capital owners. So that means labor, since labor owns 60, since labor contributes 60%, their income will be higher compared to capital owners income because they only contribute 20%. That's what it's trying to say. This market allocation is driven, or market allocation causes the distribution of income based on the contribution level and the input cost. Now we have to know the marginal productivity theory. This is the most important theory in the factor market. And under this theory, or using the cost benefit analysis in the factor market, a resource should be employed as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, up to the point where marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So we should employ more and more labor as long as marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost, but only up to the point when marginal benefit is equal to marginal cost. If marginal cost is greater than marginal benefit, we will not employ more of that labor, or we will not employ more of that capital. That's what this cost and benefit principle is saying. Now, the allocation of resources is determined by the owner of the resource input, such as labor providing the supply and firms providing the demand for factors. Okay, so when the allocation among the factors of production is combined in the most efficient manner, so when we are combining these factors of production, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur, in the most efficient manner, then we get the highest value of input and output. Okay, so basically this is important because we want to be efficient. In order to be efficient, there has to be this allocation of the resources or factors of production in the most efficient manner, so that the value of the input as well as the value of the output is highest. Now each element receives an income according to the contribution margin, or the amount of revenue generated by its use. Again, that's what I'm saying. Let's say for a water bottle, labor contributes 60% and capital contributes 20%, then labor's income will be 60% of the total revenue, and capital owner's income will be 20% of the total revenue. So whoever contributes more, their income will be higher. That's what it's trying to say. Marginal productivity theory also assumes that income is a function of contribution to output. That's what exactly it is. So that is what the theory is saying. The marginal productivity theory is saying that if you contribute more, your income will be more. If one resource input such as labor increases value output more than an equal amount of input cost from capital, then labor should be used. In that case, labor will receive highest income, or labor will receive more income and result in lower cost. So that's marginal productivity of theory, what I just said. The income that a resource receives is based on the contribution margin to the output, and if one resource, or if a labor input increases the value of output compared to an equal amount of capital, then definitely we will use more of labor, and the income that labor will receive will be higher than capital. Now the demand for most input resource is a derived demand. Okay, so whether we have demand for labor, whether we have demand for capital, whether we have demand for land such as the natural resources, it's called a derived demand. Why? Because it is derived from the demand for goods and services that it produces. So let's say, for example, in a farmland, there is demand for farmers who can produce corn farm, or for farmers who can produce corn, because there is a demand for corn in the market, only because consumers want more corns. Based on that, because in order to get corns, or in order to make corns, we need farmers who are specialized in making corn. So therefore the demand for corn will create the demand for the labor who can produce corn. So this is why it is called a derived demand. It's not a direct demand, it's a derived demand. The number of workers producing corn is directly related to the productivity of all corn factor inputs and the demand for corn by consumers for food and energy. So, and again, it's very similar to a to the law of demand. The demand for corn is basically the relationship between the price of the resources in the needed in the farm and the quantity of corn demanded at various prices. So what it's trying to say is the demand for corn, the demand that consumers have for corn will depend on the price of the resources used, because if the prices are more, that means the price of corn will be also more and the demand will go down. On the other hand, if the resources are cheaper, then corn will be cheaper and demand will go up, as well as the quantity of corn demanded at various price. So these two will determine the demand for corn. And derived demand is also determined by productivity and the market value of the goods or services produced. Now, under the I'm gonna create two scenarios. One is the perfect competition scenario. You know, the pure competition market structure, where we have a large number of buyers, large number of sellers, the products are identical or homogeneous, and you know the prices do not change. The price remains the same. Nobody changes the market price. It remains the same no matter how many output we produce. We still have the same price. So that's the perfect competition, and we will test this marginal productivity theory under the perfect competition, and then we will also look at the imperfect competition. Imperfect competition is like, you know, oligopoly or monopolistic market structure, a structure in which when you increase price, the quantity demanded will go down, and when you decrease price, quantity demanded will go up. So the price does not remain the same in this type of market structure, and price can increase or decrease, which ultimately affects the demand. So first thing first, we have to know the formula for marginal revenue product. So marginal revenue product is given by the formula, marginal revenue product is also known as MRP. So MRP is given by change in revenue divided by change in your input unit. So in this case, input is the factor of production. Okay, so how many, so let's say, how will the revenue change when I add one additional labor? That's what marginal revenue product is. So let's say, let's just assume when I am employing one labor, my revenue is, let's say, $10. When I am employing two laborers, my revenue is $15. So the difference between this 10 and 15 is $5, and that is the marginal revenue product. Basically, it's the change in revenue that results because of a change in input unit. This is your input, right? Input is basically the factor of production or the resource. And for this class, we will only focus on, in order to do this calculation, the marginal revenue product, we will only focus on labor. Okay, we won't look into capital, we won't look into a land or entrepreneur. We will just focus on labor, because that's the most common way economists do it. How you can vary the labor and see how it affects your revenue. So we will only see how your marginal revenue product changes with changes in labor, or how your revenue changes with your change in labor. That's the focus in this lecture. So going back to the slide, and we will do an example more in details. Again, here's this example. We assume that the cost to hire each additional labor is same. So let me do the example so you can understand. We can come back to this lecture, to this slide, and understand what it's saying. So let's say we assume it's a perfect competition. We will first assume it's a perfect competition, and this is important. You have to distinguish between the perfect and imperfect competition. Okay, so let's say this is a perfect competition. Okay, and we are given with this table. Worker, which is basically labor, we are given with the worker information. We are given with output, the number of goods produced. Then we need to find out the price, or we are given with product price. Then we need to find out total revenue, and we need to find out the marginal revenue product. Okay, So let's look at this from the beginning. Let's say worker is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say in this business or in this firm or this firm under the perfectly competitive market structure, they will only hire up to 5 workers. They will not hire more than 5 workers. Just as an assumption, okay? Now when they hire 0 worker, nobody is working, therefore output will also be 0 and price will be $3, okay? Let's say that's given. Now when I am hiring or when I'm employing 1 worker or 1 labor, my output is 10. My price still remains $3 because it's perfect competition. Remember, the market price will not change with your quantity in a perfect competition market. That's why we have price equals to marginal revenue is equal to average revenue in a perfect competition market. Okay, then again, when I employ 2 laborers, then my output goes up to 19 and price of the output still remains $3 because it's a perfect competition. Basically, it will remain $3 for all possible points. Okay, and let's say output is given. When I use 3 laborers, I have 27 output. When I have 4 laborers, I have 34 output, and when I have 5 labor, I can produce 40 output. Okay, so we are given with this information and then we have to calculate the total revenue and the marginal revenue product. Now remember, total revenue is easy to calculate. That's price times quantity or price times your output. So for the first level, it's 0 times 3, so total revenue is 0. For the second level, it's 10 times 3, so it's 30. For the third, for when we are employing 2 workers, it is 19 times 3, which is $57. Then we have 27 times 3, which is 81. Then we have 34 times 6. Sorry, 34 times 3 is 102. And finally, we have 40 times 3, which is 120. So that is your total revenue. As you increase your worker, your output goes up, price remains the same because of the market structure, and total revenue is also going up because your output is going up. But in that case, I mean, it's a good thing, right? As we are adding more workers, our revenue is going up. But that's not how we will analyze. We will have to look at the marginal revenue product and see what is the best way or what is the best place we should operate. Should we hire 1 labor? Should we hire 2 labor? Should we hire 3 labor? So we have to determine that. Okay, so let's say marginal revenue product in this case is basically the change in total revenue divided by change in workers. So if you look at it, 30 minus 0 divided by change in worker is just 1. So here MRP is $30. Okay, here MRP is $27. Here MRP is $24. Here MRP is $21. And here MRP is $18. What I did is basically just the difference between the total revenue in each points divided by the difference in workers, and difference in workers is always 1 because 2 minus 1 is 1, 3 minus 2 is 1, 4 minus 3 is 1, 5 minus 4 is 1. Whereas here we do 30 minus 0 is 30, 57 minus 30 is 27, 81 minus 57 is 24, 102 minus 81 is 21, 120 minus 102 is 18. So now we see as we are adding more workers, the marginal revenue product is actually going down, right? But how are we going to decide, or what is the point we should be operating at? What is the most efficient point in this type of market structure? Now for that, we need to know is the firm, whether in a perfect competition or a imperfect competition, will always operate where marginal revenue product is equals to your marginal cost, or marginal factor cost. MFC means marginal factor cost. Okay, so whenever the firm's marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal cost of the factor, what is the marginal cost of labor? What is the marginal cost of labor? That's what we are going to compare, and then whenever they are equal, we will be operating, or we will be employing that number of workers or labor. So here we don't have any information about marginal fixed cost, but let's say you're also given the cost, basically the number of the wage for each worker is, let's say, $23. Okay, for each workers the wage is $23. Okay, so let's say we're given with this and it stays the same, it's fixed. We will assume the marginal factor cost is constant in both the perfect competition and imperfect competition. Let's assume the marginal factor cost is fixed. So in this case, let's see, if we are hiring 0 workers, we are incurring 0 cost. Okay, now if we are hiring 1 worker, the cost is $23. So the marginal fixed cost in this case, if we are hiring 1 worker, the marginal fixed cost in this case is $23. Now this $23, we compare it to $30. So in this case, when we are hiring 1 worker, MRP is 30, is greater than MFC. So is greater than MFC, which is actually 23. Sorry about that. So that means we will continue to go on, because we have to go on until MRP is equal to MFC. Okay, so let's look at the next point. If we hire 2 laborers, the cost is still $23 per worker. So 2 times 23. Okay, so it's still, well, we just look at the marginal cost. So the marginal cost is basically another $23, right? Now this $23 is greater than $27. So still MRP, because we are looking at the marginals, right? So we are not adding up the totals. It's still greater than that, so we will still hire more laborers, because our marginal revenue product is greater than marginal fixed cost, and it makes sense for us to hire more labor or workers. Now let's see if we hire 3 workers. Again, our cost is $23, right? The additional cost to hire the third labor is, again, it's $33. It's fixed. But in this case, the marginal revenue product is now $24, which is again greater than $23. So yes, it makes sense. We will hire 3 laborers because MRP is greater than MFC. 23, 24, and 23. Now let's go to 4 unit. Now cost remains the same. It's still 23. The cost to hire the 4th labor is also $23, the extra cost. But what about our marginal revenue product? Right now, our marginal revenue product for 4th one is 21. 21 is less than $23. So in this case, MRP is actually less than MFC, and it does not make any business logic. It is not a logical decision for a business to operate when MRP is less than MFC. So in this scenario, if I ask you how many labor will be employed, you will say 3 workers will be employed, because we will keep on going until MRP is equal to MFC. And we can see in between the third, this is the third, in between the third and the 4th labor, somewhere it happens MRP is equal to MFC. Okay, so we will hire, in this scenario, we will hire 3 workers, because that is the point until MRP is greater than MFC. We will not hire the 4th one, because that's when the marginal revenue product is less than your marginal factor cost. So hope that clarifies what we are trying to do, and hope that gives you an idea what firms use when they are trying to hire employees. They basically compare the marginal revenue product to the marginal factor cost and see where they are equal or where they are closest to one another. and where marginal revenue product is greater than marginal fixed cost, they will operate there, or where marginal revenue product is equal to marginal fixed factor cost. So make sure you understand this. Another thing we have to know is we do based on this graph is basically we will draw a graph using this information. Okay, so we will draw here we have a graph. On the x-axis we will have number of workers or labor, number of labor, and on the y-axis we will have MRP. Okay, so when we will in between, let's say 0, in between 0 and 1, right, in between 0 and 1, which is 0.5, we have 30. So in between them we will take the points in between 1 and 2, because that this point is in between the two numbers, right? In between 1 and 2 we have 27. Okay, and then in between 3 and 2 we have 24. So it will look like this. Okay, so that's how the curve will look like, and that's called the marginal revenue product. And we usually compare this graph with the graph of imperfect competition market. Okay, now hopefully this explains what we are doing in a perfect competition market structure. Okay, price remains the same, it does not change, and because products are identical, large number of buyers and sellers, so we just look at the marginal revenue product and marginal fixed cost. But we follow the same principle when we look at the imperfect competition market structure. Okay, again, these are something in this slide. If you see, these are basically some of the information for the example we just did. We assume that the cost to hire each additional labor is $23 and it will remain the same. It also assumes that the short run, it's a short run plant, and it will only employ up to 5 workers, right? We looked at it and saw that they can only employ up to 5 workers, and the cost is $23, uh, which remains the same for each additional worker. So if you see, as more workers are added after some point of input, additional object is subject to the law of diminishing return with decreasing amount of marginal product per additional worker. So what it's trying to say is basically as you're increasing more and more of workers, your marginal product is decreasing. So this theory is the basis for the efficient factor allocation. Each additional input resource should be added as long as it contributes greater MRP than the marginal factor cost until MRP is equal to MFC. So the MRP is the demand for the labor resource. The demand for workers is determined by the value it adds to the marginal revenue product. And that's the graph I did. Basically, the graph I did is basically the demand for the labor resource. Okay, this graph I drew, basically this is the demand for labor resource or demand for worker. Okay, so then now we move our focus onto imperfect competition. Imperfect competition is when there is the prices do not remain the same. That's going to be the biggest difference between these two examples. The prices will change. As prices go down, your output will go up. That's what we're going to look up, and vice versa also. Okay, so marginal productive theory so far we applied for competitive market, but it can be used for the imperfect market. In an imperfect competitive market, the cost of labor input and the price of the products will vary with market forces. But again, in this type of market structure, we will still assume that the marginal factor cost, the cost to hire an additional worker, remains the same. It does not change. Okay, so we will assume that. However, in imperfect, price decreases to increase quantity demanded. With a decrease in price, the marginal revenue product drops more quickly from a higher level of output and results in fewer workers being hired. So what it's saying is, because when price drops, the MRP will drop further, because before we had fixed prices, but output were increases, so revenue went up. But with prices going down, although output is going up, but revenue will not go up that much. So the drop in marginal revenue product will be higher. As a result, in imperfect competition, they will hire less workers. Okay, so that's what they are trying to say. In a perfect competition market structure, firms will hire more workers. In an imperfect competition market structure, they will hire less workers. Now let's do an example again and see how it's different from a perfect competition. Okay, so let's clear the board and let's look at imperfect competition. So now we are looking at imperfect. Okay, again, let's say we are given with 5 worker situations, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, then we're given with output, let's say 0, 10, 19, 27, 34, 40. I have not changed the output, it's still the same as the perfect competition, but in this case the price changes. Under a perfect competition, in perfect competition, the market price does not remain the same. In order to sell more, you have to reduce the price because the products are not identical. Products are differentiated, so you're competing with one another. So in order to sell more, you have to reduce your price. So let's say we're given for, when it's $0, it's 4. So when it's $4, basically there's 0 workers and 0 output. Then it's 3.5. Let's say it's 3.5. Then it's 3.2. Then it's 2.9. The price is decreasing, and as you see, as the price is decreasing, your output is going up. 2.6 and 2.3. So these are given to you. You don't have to calculate this. These are given to you. But the basic point is, in this imperfect market competition, as your prices are going up, your output is going up. But the total revenue will increase, but not at the same level as in a perfect competition because your price is dropping, right? So let's now, the formula is basically calculate the total revenue and calculate the marginal revenue product. Okay, just like before. So total revenue is easy to calculate. Output times price, 0, 35. Oops, sorry, let me fix this. 10 times 3.5 is 35. Okay, then we have 19 times 3.2 is 60.8. Then we have 27 times 2.9 is 78.3. Then we have 34 times 2.6, we have 88.4. Then we have 40 times 2.3, we have $92. If you compare these revenues with the total revenues of a perfect competition market that I just did, you will see these revenue numbers are actually less, except for the first one. All the other ones are actually less than the previous one, to a perfect competition one. So that's why, your drop in marginal revenue product is more. The drop in MRP is more in this case because prices are going down. And same way you calculate the marginal revenue product, which is change in total revenue divided by change in input or change in worker. In this case, it's 35. This is 25.8. This is 17.5. This is 10.1. And this is 3.6. Okay, so that's the marginal revenue product. Now again, let's say we are given that the marginal fixed cost is $23. Remember, just like that, to hire each additional worker, it will cost $23. Okay, so let's remember, we will go on until MRP equals to MFC. Okay, so when it's 0, when it's between 0 and 1, when I hire one additional worker, MRP is 35, MFC is 23. 35 is greater than 23. This is for one labor. So yes, we will hire one labor. If we hire the second labor, our MRP is 25.8, which is still greater than $23. So yes, we will hire 2 laborers. Now let's look at the third labor. This time, if I am hiring 3 laborers, my marginal revenue product is 17.5. But this is less than my marginal fixed cost, which is $23. So makes no sense to hire the third labor. So again, if you see in this type of market structure, we will end up hiring 2 laborers. And that's what I was trying to tell. In a perfect competition, if you remember, the answer was 3 laborers. We will hire 3 laborers, whereas here in this imperfect competition, because there is the drop in marginal revenue product is more, we will only hire 2 laborers. Okay, so that's how you will differentiate. And this time we will again draw the graph. Now here number of workers and here MRP, and it will be more steeper. For an imperfect competition, it will be more steeper. Again, I want to do this graph in a clear page, but hopefully this is clear to you guys. What it's trying to say is basically when you have an imperfect market competition, the drop in marginal revenue product is more because of the decrease in prices, and as a result we will be hiring less labor, as long as MRP is equals to MFC. Okay, and in terms of the graph, let me do the graph. So remember, this was the number of workers, and on the y-axis we had MRP. This was for a perfect competition, when price did not change, and when a drop in MRP was less. But for an imperfect competition, it will basically look like this, more steeper, imperfect, because the drop in MRP is more with the number of labors added. So you need to make sure you understand this. The marginal revenue product for the perfect competition market structure is less steep, and the marginal revenue product curve, or the demand for labor resources for an imperfect competition market structure, is more steep. So hope this gives you a very clear scenario of how it happens, or how the factors are allocated, how labor is allocated in a perfect competition, and how labor is allocated in an imperfect competition market. Now, the demand for labor within a competitive market is more responsive to decrease in price of labor than imperfect competitive market, right? So the demand for labor, so if the price of labor, if the cost of labor goes down, the demand for labor will go up more in a competitive market than the demand for labor in an imperfect competition. This is because as price drops for labor in a competitive market, more labor resources are added than in imperfect competition. The imperfect competitive producer is less likely to hire more labor because the price of the product drops with increase in output, right? Again, think about it. In a perfect competition, if the cost of if let's say the $23 was the cost, now if the cost went down to $15, we will probably hire more workers. But in an imperfect competition, we will probably hire, if the cost goes down to $15, we will probably hire 1 additional worker, but not as much as perfect competition, because in this imperfect competition market structure, our price is also going down with increase in output. So basically, the demand for labor in a competitive market is more responsive to decreases in price changes for the labor, the cost of the labor. Also, the demand curve of competitive producer falls because of decrease in marginal productivity with the increase in the number of workers. However, in an imperfectly competitive market, the demand falls because of decrease in marginal productivity as well as the decrease in prices. Two things are happening. In competitive market, only one thing happens. There is a decrease in marginal productivity as we increase more workers. But in imperfect competition, there is a decrease in marginal productivity with more workers added. At the same time, the prices are also decreasing. So that's the main difference between the two. Now, for the labor market, we have a graph, and I wanted to show you. Um, it's not very important, but just have a brief idea. Basically, the labor market, this is your wage, and this is your quantity of labor. Okay, so it basically looks like a graph like this. Okay, not so, it's going to be like this. Yeah, so the graph looks like this. And then again, basically it says, the marginal fixed cost with the increase in marginal factor cost. As marginal factor cost increases, you will, up to a certain point, you will hire more, and then it will go down. That's what is basically saying. It's not that important, just know the shape, and the firm will operate at the point where marginal factor cost is equal to the marginal revenue product. Now, couple of things we have to know is the demand for resource factor of land, labor, entrepreneur, and capital. Basically, the demand for the factors of production depend on the demand for the product. As we said, the derived demand. It also depends on the productivity of each factor and the change in price of the factor. So there are three things. So the demand for labor, let's say, will depend on the demand for that product, the productivity of labor, and the change in price of labor. Similarly, the demand for capital will depend on how much capital is needed to make that product or to make the finished product, what is the productivity of capital, and the change in price for capital. Okay, so three things: the demand for product, productivity of each factor, and the change in price. Again, for instance, as an example, let's say the demand for wheat farmers, here wheat farmers are the labor, depends how much consumers demand wheat. That's the first one, the demand for the product, how much consumers demand for wheat. Second one is productivity of the farmer, how quickly they can produce. The farmers, let's say a farmer can produce 1 ton of wheat in 3 hours, whereas another farmer can produce 1 ton of wheat in 5 hours. So the first farmer is definitely more productive because he can produce more wheat than the second farmer. So that is a determining factor for the demand. And lastly, it also depends uh, the fertility of land, each considered individually relative to the output as well. And the last factor that it depends on is basically the price of that, or the cost of that farmer. If the cost of that farmer is high, I will probably demand less. If the cost of the farmer is less, I will demand more. So if price of resource change, then each element is subject to a shift in demand for the factor of production. Okay, the factor allocation increases if productivity of a factor increases, the value of the input increases MRP. Again, what it's trying to say is if a better trained farmer, or if a better trained farmer labor or farmer results in higher output, basically we will hire more labor as compared to new capital. Labor services are greater value, or if so we will hire more labor. Or in other case, basically if new capital is more efficient and less expensive, then the value of capital increases. In that case, when input price changes, a firm may change the mix of input to reduce cost even with the same output. So what it's trying to say is, if the price of labor and capital changes, let's say price of labor remains the same but price of capital goes down, so what producers will try to do is they will try to increase the use of capital and decrease the use of labor and produce the same quantity of output, because in the factor market, the labor and factor are often considered substitutes, so they will probably do that. Similarly, what it's also trying to say is, if the labor is better trained, if the labor has more value than the capital, then they will use more labor than capital. That's what it's trying to say. And the price will be also a determining factor, right? If the price of labor is more than the price of capital, then probably the demand for capital will be more than the labor, and vice versa. So again, I just told you, but capital in the factor markets, capital and labor are often substitutable for one another. Maybe a farmer can produce wheat, maybe we can replace the farmer with a robot to produce wheat. So this is just an example for you to understand, but capital and labor can be used as substitutes. So if price of labor increases and all other factors remain the same, the farms will use more capital, right? Because they're substitutable, and if labor has become more expensive, so now I will use more capital. On the other hand, all other things remain the same. If price of capital decreases, more capital will be used and less labor, and this is called substitution effect. Basically, substitution effect is when the price of labor increases, so we use more capital, or price of capital decreases, all other factors remaining the same, we will use more capital than labor. So that's substitution effect, because we are substituting the capital for labor. This is known as substitution effect. But there is also another effect that we have to take into account in case of demand. So when there is a decrease in cost, basically when we have a decrease in cost that results in increased demand, the output effect occurs. So we have to compare the substitution effect and the output effect. We know what a substitution effect is. It basically means when the price of labor goes up, we use more capital, or when the price of capital goes down, we use more capital instead of labor. Now what does output effect says? Output effect says as the price of capital decreases, cost and price of the product decrease, so more units or more output will be purchased. As more output, with the decrease in cost and therefore prices, more workers will be employed to produce the larger quantity of goods. So what it's trying to say is that what the output effect is trying to say is basically when the price of the good decreases, or when the price of capital decreases, the price of the good also decreases, right? So when the price of the good decreases, the demand from consumers will go up. When the demand for consumers will go up, producers will try to produce more of that output, and as a result they will hire more labor. That's what it's trying to say. So that is called output effect. Even though the cost of capital is going down, what is happening is your cost of production is going down, so you are going to charge lower prices to the consumers. As a result of this decrease in prices, consumers will demand more output, and in return what the farmers will do, they will increase their output, but in order to increase their output they will need more laborers. So that's the opposite. It's a positive effect. With the increase in capital use, we are also using more labor in this case. So that's output effect. So the difference between substitution effect and output effect is called net effect. And a substitution effect has a negative sign, output effect has a positive sign. So we have to look at both the impacts and see what is the balance between the two and what is the actual impact on the demand for labor. Now the total demand for labor depends on the goods goods and services, demand for goods and services, the productivity of labor compared to the productivity of capital, and the price of labor compared to the price of capital, right? Again, these are the three things that determine the demand for labor: the demand for goods and services, the productivity of labor compared to the productivity of capital, the price of labor compared to the price of capital. Now the demand for labor will increase if there is an increase in demand for the product using the labor. So if if there is an increase in demand for wheat, we will demand more wheat farmers. So that's what it's trying to say. If there is an increase in the productivity of labor, if farmers can produce now more more tons of wheat in an hour, then their productivity has gone up, and then the demand will also go up. Also, if there is a decrease in the price of the farmer, if they have started taking lower wages, then their demand will go up. And finally, if there is an increase in the price of capital, if robots and machines are more expensive to use, then definitely the farms will rely on the labor to do most of the work, and that's why the demand for labor will go up. So in a labor market, we will have a normal demand curve. The demand curve for labor is also downward sloping. This is labor, demand for labor. So basically what it's saying is, let's say if the price of labor goes down, if price of labor goes down, then demand curve will shift to the right. Okay, and if let's say the price of capital goes down, demand curve will also shift to the right. Okay, so that's how demand curves will interact in the market. Now what about supply? So we looked at the demand curve. Supply curves for demand, for supply curve for labor are also like normal products. It's an upward sloping curve. This is supply curve, and the supply curve will depend on leisure and income. Okay, so basically again, for the demand we had two impacts, the substitution impact and the output impact. For supply we again have two impacts. One is called the income effect, the second one is called the substitution effect. Okay, so let's first talk about the substitution effect. Okay, individual workers will choose how they allocate their time when an increase in demand for labor increases wages. Substitute effect for individual workers occur when individuals decide to work more and consume less leisure, thus increasing supply. Okay, so what it's trying to say is when labor price increases, the workers decide to work more instead of spending more time for leisure, so supply goes up. That's what the substitution effect says. On the other hand, the income effect is opposite. What it's saying is when the wage of the workers goes up, or when the income goes up, individuals or supplier or the labor decides that they will spend more time for holidays and vacations and leisure, and they will work less because they are earning more now, so they can go and spend more time, relaxed time and free time, and as a result the supply will go down. So that's the income effect. Again, the difference between the substitution effect and the income effect will determine the ultimate supply of labor. So you have to, I don't want you to confuse, you have to understand under the demand for labor, there's two effects, substitution effect and output effect, which compares labor to capital. Under the supply of labor, we have two impacts. Substitution effect, which basically compares the wage and how much time they will spend for work and leisure, and income effect. So we compare these, and then we finally come up with the equilibrium in the labor market, the final demand for labor and the final supply of labor in the market, which ultimately determines the equilibrium. It's just like a normal demand and supply curve, demand curve being downward sloping, supply curve being upward sloping, intersecting, and the intersecting point is basically the equilibrium. Now, the best allocation of capital and labor, most efficient combination of capital and labor together will determine the quantity of each used. Again, the basic principle of cost benefit analysis is applied to each of the factors, and if marginal product of labor divided by cost of labor is greater than marginal product of capital divided by cost of capital, more labor should be employed. So what we are trying to say is, if marginal product of labor divided by cost of labor is greater than marginal product of capital divided by cost of capital, in this scenario we should employ more labor, because here marginal productivity of labor is more than capital, and this will continue until marginal product of labor divided by cost of labor is equal to marginal product of capital divided by cost of capital. So this is the point where we have an equilibrium. If the opposite happens, if marginal let's say the opposite happens, let's say marginal product of labor divided by cost of labor is actually less than marginal product of capital divided by cost of capital, in that case we will employ more capital. Okay, until this is true. Okay, Now, that's the marginal productivity of theory. There are some criticisms of marginal productivity of theory. People say that this cannot be universally applied because of market failures. Not all markets operate like a perfect competition, or there are market failures happening in the, we discussed about the market failures in macroeconomics and in also earlier this class. So because of that, it's not possible to universally apply this model. Individuals are not always paid according to their contribution because of the inability of the economy to fully utilize all the workers at their highest and best use. So what it's trying to say, critics are saying that workers, they don't get paid based on their contribution amount, because their skills are not used to their highest level. So this theory assumes that whoever will contribute more will get more. Is not true. That's what the critics are saying. Okay. Another thing is that the marginal contribution of each factor input is often difficult to compute. It's very difficult to compute the marginal productivity for a 1 unit of capital or for 1 unit of labor. Well, in an example, it's easy, but if it's assume it's a large firm with thousands of workers and thousands of outputs, it's very difficult to calculate and then to give a number. So for these, there are critics that marginal productivity theory, but in reality, this theory is very useful, and it is used in almost all types of micro concepts, and to identify the role of each factors of production and the relationship with efficient use. So that's the end of this lecture. From next class, next week, we will focus on lecture 15. Until then, you guys stay safe and email me if there's any question.